Thank you. It's great to be back at SLU. I have a great appreciation for the education I received here. At the medical school back in the 1980s, they had a department of communication skills that surpasses what almost any modern era medical school has. And that's the kind of thing that stood by me every single day in my clinical practice. And so it's great to be back at SLU. I appreciate the Brian Cox perspective of looking at the Earth and at our past in order to understand where we move forward. If our charting the unknown is our theme today, it suggests sort of navigators with instruments and stars that guide them. Or if we're more modern, a control panel with radar and lights that are blinking. And one of the problems I'm experiencing in this world these days is so many lights are blinking that most of us would kind of like to navigate our way back to 2014 or maybe 1995. And so charting our way into the unknown of our future begins by looking back. And that means help me out. There we go. Conifers in the Pacific Northwest, late spring, early summer. What you can faintly see in the rising wind is pollen that's being blown off those conifers, which is how they reproduce. That pollen is the male gamete off on the wind in search of an ovary. And most of it lands on the ground or on water. It's a very unlikely thing that it will reach an ovary. But that's the strategy that plants used until 150 million years ago. Humans have been around about 150,000, maybe 200,000 years for the earliest. We're talking about 150 million years ago when all plants pollinated on the wind. But there was an innovation that evolved 150 million years ago that changed things. And that was the first time that a plant developed a specialized structure that invited an insect to interact with it and bring that pollen to the next plant. It was the first blossom, the first flower. And that first flower probably had no scent and no petals, just a little bit of nectar and probably a little sticky. But what's happened in the hundreds of centuries since is that plants have evolved more and more specified structures to attract animals, particularly insects. We think of bees and butterflies, also hummingbirds. And this evolution has led to the diversity of life as we know it. It allowed for an explosion in the diversity of species, so that there were fruits that were produced by these plants that could be eaten by animals and distribute the seeds, so that there was specialized structures of so many kinds that they had wild and considerable shapes and aesthetics, and that these insects evolved along with the plants to have this drive. And of course, humans were much more sophisticated than these insects. However, we do have a $32 billion perfume industry, and in the next several days, the cut flower industry, which is a $30 billion industry, is going to see most of its revenue driven by pair bonding and romantic relationships. So there's beauty in these flowers, and sometimes more than meets the eye, or at least the human eye, because we see in the red, blue, green color spectrum. But these pollinators, butterflies and bees, they see in blue-green infrared. So this rather plain-looking dandelion, to us, to a pollinator, looks like that. And that red draws the pollinator to an area where there will be maximal nectar and maximal contact with the pollen. It's interesting when you start to see the world from the point of view of a pollinator, because this verdant field of corn, which stretches as far as the eye can see, to a pollinator, looks like that. Nothing there for them. particularly in the era when we have herbicides and corn and soybeans that are resistant to the herbicides. When we are growing fields, large fields like that, it is essentially a wasteland. There's no shelter, there's no sustenance, there's no larval host species. It's a monoculture. 30% of the United States land is now occupied by our large agriculture. But the largest occupier of space is not our cities or our pavements or corn and soybeans. It's this: turf lawn, turf grass. More turf grass in the United States than all of the corn and soybeans and fruit trees and cities combined. And there's nothing there for pollinators. Close your eyes for a second, if you will, and indulge me just for a second, and I'll close mine. And picture in your mind an apple tree. Close your eyes. Great. Picture an apple tree in spring, more blossom than leaf. Beautiful white blossoms, fragrant, little hints of pink. But it's not silent or still. There's insects moving from one flower to another. Picture a bumblebee, nice, big, fat, charismatic bumblebee, ducking its head inside of a flower. Open your eyes for a sec. How many of you saw a bumblebee with a rear end that was mostly black? While we're raising hands, how many of you are under the age of 30? Lots of you. This is Bombus borealis. This is one of the species of bumblebees that we have. In our region, we have 17 different species of bumblebees. What's interesting and alarming is that when you who are under the age of 30 were born, we had all 17. And now we're down to 10. So of those 7 that are endangered, 4 are gone. We won't see them again. And that's unusual, to lose 4 species. In the ordinary course of time, ordinary circumstances, if you lost a bumblebee species when you were born 25 years ago, the 4th species would disappear in the year 3,400. In the time of the flowers, we saw an exponential rise in species. And we have to acknowledge that we're beginning to see an exponential decline. To lose 4 species in 30 years represents that. That's an almond grove in California. We have 600,000 acres of almonds in California. I think a lot of us know a little bit about the water cost of almonds, but most of us aren't aware that if you looked at those trees, if we were standing in that grove, there's a kind of silent stillness to them. There are no critters moving from blossom to blossom. You plant 140 almond trees an acre, you get no almonds, because their native pollinators are gone or insufficient. You have 3 weeks of beautiful blossoms. How could you not have animals to feed on them? After those 3 weeks, as far as the eye can see, you've got a monoculture. You've got turf grass and leaves, nothing for them. So what are we doing? Trucking in honeybees. I haven't spoken about honeybees. Most of us think about pollinators, we think about honeybees, right? They're not a native pollinator. In fact, they're European, but they're workhorses because you move them around. So in order to get almonds, what we're doing is trucking in honeybees to those big hive bodies. That's one hive. You put them on a pallet, 6 of them. You get 3 pallets high and put them on a truck. You get 400 on a truck. That means 3,000 trucks with honeybees moving across from around the country to one spot where they stay for a few weeks, pollinate the almonds, and then distribute themselves back across, or get driven back across the country. Same time that apples are blooming in the Northeast and Northwest, and blueberries in the Michigan and Maine, same season. It's hard to get 1.2 million hives. It's a very expensive thing because 44% of the hives died last year. Didn't make it through the winter, 44%. And one of the reasons they did is because of the diseases they're experiencing. And one of the reasons they're experiencing diseases is because you take them and move them all together for a few weeks and then distribute them across the country. If you were a bee disease and you wanted to design a way of getting around, this is how you design it. Just like if you were a virus and you wanted to get around amongst humans, you'd design an airliner. Let's put them all together, no, closer, for hours. Rebreathe the air. The honeybee is still a commercially important pollinator. But if you look at a particular mite that's coming along called Tropolilaps, if you want to look it up, it's lived in parasitic balance with the Asian bees, but as it's moving just like the Varroa mites into the bees in the United States and other populations, we might lose the honeybee. Depending on that one species is extremely unwise. So what else might we do? These are people in southwest China. They're pollinating with hand, by hand. They have paintbrushes in their hand. If you ever cut an apple in half and you get 6 seeds, that's because each of the ovules received a pollen grain. That's hard to do by hand. I can't see myself up there. And only certain plants could you possibly pollinate by hand. This flower you'll recognize. Anybody know what it is? Passion fruit. It's a large flower that gets pollinated mostly by the carpenter bee. The largest producer is Brazil, and the carpenter bee, when you think of Brazil, you think of deforestation. You think of carpenter bees and you infer maybe that their habitat requires wood as shelter. So as we've seen a decline in carpenter bees, we're seeing a decline in passion fruit. It's a large blossom. You can get to it by hand. It's tedious and expensive. What this means is that your great-grandchild can have fruit salad at her wedding, but it's going to be impossibly expensive. More than the first world problem of fruit salad at your wedding, as we go from a population in 50 years that's doubled from 3 billion to 7 billion, and look at 2050, when we get to 10 billion, only about 2 billion of those people will be from the industrialized world. Those other 8 billion, more than are living on the entire Earth right now, 8 billion are mostly dependent on what grows from the ground and falls from the trees, on what pollinators supply. Every place you look at turf grass planting is an opportunity to create critical habitat support for pollinators. Our project is looking at the solar fields that are going in as an opportunity to try and create the habitat to support pollinators. What does that involve? If you just don't put down turf grass and throw in wildflower seed, in a few years' time, you'll have all the native invasives and non-native invasives and nothing much more sustaining for pollinators. It means working intentionally to create an enduring meadow. It means attending to getting an understanding of the 275 native bee species and about twice that number butterfly and moth species, what their habitat needs are, what their shelter needs are, what their larval host species needs are. About 75% of those native bees are ground bees. If you just till this all up, you'll destroy them. If you mow it in the middle of summer, you'll destroy all the larvae that are pupating in the plants. Understanding that and working it so you're working only 1/3 of the soil at a time. Looking, for example, at the trees that you might shield that visibility shield for that solar field, like a project management. So you have a graph of when they're going to be blooming. You're trying to create something like a slow-moving fireworks display, so there's a continuous succession of bloom as you move throughout the season. Minnesota is way ahead of us on this. In Minnesota, they've got 2,300 acres planted under solar fields. The Stearns County part of Minnesota just made it a mandate. If you're going to put in solar, you have to put the forage for pollinators underneath. In terms of measuring impact, does it help pollinators? The first field we planted in 2016 was measured the year before, August 2nd, 2015, 11 a.m., by a survey approach, which means you walk a 200-foot corridor on the margin of your field and you count unique pollinator encounters. If you see a monarch and then see that same monarch a few seconds later, that's one. If you see two monarchs, that's two. But you're just walking a 200-foot corridor in 7.5 minutes and counting unique pollinator encounters. And then you go to the center of your measurement area and do the same thing. 7.5 minutes, 200 feet, count the pollinators. The first year, before we did the installation, there was 34 unique pollinator encounters in 15 minutes. 1 year later, same circumstances, same kind of day, sunny, without much wind, 174 unique pollinator encounters in 15 minutes. There's an opportunity. And it doesn't end with solar fields, but it's a beginning. The people who develop solar fields are by nature looking at another bottom line, saying this is a place which can be profitable, but also not warm the earth. If there's a solution that humans have, it's our ability to actually recognize things, chart a path, and act together to correct things. And that's what we're about. So thank you for hearing me out.